Hey guys, it's been a while. This time I wanted to do an Overwatch video because I had a burning question in my mind about the ending of Contenders, which was basically how do you beat the GOATs. And there were two teams I was looking at throughout the seasons in the various regions, and one of them was Element Mystic, who lived and died off of their Doomfist. And the other one was British Hurricane, who also lived and died off of their Doomfist. And luckily, we have one of the British Hurricane Analysts, Dreamcast, with us, and also Volamel, who's turned from content creator back to analyst and then back again. Right?
We do it all here.
Yeah. So to start off, I guess I'll I'll explain how I was thinking about the Doomfist. Basically, I guess I'll start off with this. Every time I saw Element Mystic on a control map, they would always lose like the first fight, but then they'd end up winning anyway. And that generally goes against like the whole 60% win rate on like control maps if you win the first team fight, right? So I was like, okay, there's something clearly going on in this entire strategy that I'm not necessarily aware of. And then when I looked into it, it's like, well, it seems to me he's either like the Doomfist player. What was his name?
Sparkle.
Sparkle, yeah.
Sparkle, yeah.
Yeah, Sparkle. Basically, as far as I could tell, like they were pocketing Sparkle. Like, okay, you get this bubble, or you get like the Brigade armor, and then you dive in, and then isolate the tank from the rest of the line, and then you just destroy them. That's kind of how I looked at it. But we may as well get the expert opinion of somebody who does this for a living. So, what do you think about the Doomfist Dreamcast?
Sure. So, the Doomfist Goats comp that both Element Mystic ran and then at British Hurricane we ran as well definitely is a lot about, especially in those first fights on control, about isolating the front line. In general, you kind of have two modes of operation. You have the I'm going to bust the front line up, which works when you're on flat ground, when you don't have an advantage, when you have to kind of push into them. Or if you're trying to set up an uppercut shatter combo, because unlike the Brigitte bash, uppercut's displacement does not get stopped by a Zarya bubble. So that's a really big like bread and butter combo for the comp is you can uppercut the Reinhardt and then shatter everyone behind him. And they can't really do anything to prevent that. But the other option is to go on the back line and to jump the Zen and either force a lot of peel on the Zen or force the Transcendence out without having to use one of your tank ults, the Earth Shatter or the Graviton, that you usually want to hold the Transcendence to counter those. So if you can force that out early in the fight, that's really good. And the best way for the Doomfist to have both of those options to choose between is to have a high ground position, right? Doomfist loves high ground for his slam. That's why outside of GOATs, Doomfist is usually played on defense and not that much on attack because you want that high ground positional control. And we found the exact same thing happen when we played the Doomfist comp. And it's not just on control. A lot of the times your first fight is just really difficult to win because if you're on flat ground, if you're on even ground, attacking or in that very first fight in control where it's a wash, you have a hard time getting an opening because the same amount the Doomfist can get pocketed to do displacement and do damage, you just pocket the Reinhardt, and it makes it very difficult to convert off that kill unless you have some very clever angles of approach. So I think you're pretty on the nose with your initial take.
All right. What do you think about the Doomfist Volamel? Do you think it was actually the answer to GOATs?
Do I think it was the answer? I mean, we started to see some compositions that featured Doomfist that I thought could have started to give teams trouble. I just don't think that they either gave it enough breathing room to try and actually run it enough as possible, or it actually just wasn't the case and teams would counter it. I don't think the composition that Element Mystic ran was specifically all that strong. I thought it was pretty counterable. I know that Dream had a few different ways that they like to run it on British Hurricane, which he obviously can get into after I finish this. But yeah, in general, I thought it was pretty straightforward. Like you win really hard, and if you have to retake it, it didn't seem like either Element Mystic did a good job retaking, which kind of seems to be a theme after looking through their VOD this morning, specifically against Meta Athena. It seemed like they had a really difficult time coming back into the Goats v Goats matchup, especially when they had the Doomfist. But if they could win early, for both of these teams, they tended to be successful. But I know that Dream, like, again, there was multiple different ways that you guys ran it. So could you kind of break that down?
Sure. Well, I will say my take is standard Goats played perfectly beats Doomfist Goats. I 100% believe that. I think that Element Mystic ran the Doomfist Goats because they were having like weird personnel and identity issues throughout the season, right? Sparkle is a flex DPS, but he was playing the Zarya for them. That's normally the hit scans role, but he's like kind of the star, the carry player. So similar to Yaki in Korea, who's also a flex DPS that actually moved over and played the Zarya instead of the more traditional roles. They were struggling a lot early in the season and were kind of having trouble figuring out how they were going to deal with the Goats meta. They were not beating other teams in straight up Goats v Goats. So they decided that they were going to make this change and they were going to have Sparkle on the Doomfist, have their off tank play the Zarya instead. And that was just going to work better for them for their identity. So I think that they had good reasons to run the comp. We were in a similar situation where we had to make a lot of personnel changes because of Overwatch League signings in the midseason. We picked up a stellar Doomfist player, and we just felt like we would be able to get to a higher level and a level that would be much harder for teams to deal with on the Doomfist comp than we would be able to integrate and to rebuild that really tight synergy in Europe where, peak Goats is played. We thought that we would have the best chance to throw people off with the Doomfist comp. But I think Standard played well, does win, and it's because Doomfist can't really take space that well. You'll see that when Element Mystic had their most success on that comp, it was on defense. And particularly if you go back and look at Hollywood, where they would play the defensive second point very far forward, almost fighting on first point again, that's when they were just completely shutting teams down because they have that high ground for Sparkle to play on that's split off from the rest of the team. So he can choose to either go on their back line, try and one-shot the Zen, or he can engage on the tanks while they're looking forward at, the enemy tank line. So, yeah, I do think that Standard does win when executed correctly. It's just very, very hard to execute if you aren't prepared for the different looks that the Doomfist comp can bring.
Okay, yeah. I was about to bring up that point, too, because the way you talked about the Doomfist into the Goats, like the first fight's always the hardest, and that's why you actually see Element Mystic almost always lose the first defensive point on Hollywood. But the second they get to the second defensive point, that's when you get the high ground, that's when you get the space. That's when it becomes a lot harder for the Goats comp to actually track where he is and how to deal with him effectively. So yeah, I pretty much agree with that assessment. And I also agree with the fact that, like, when you think about that particular team and your team too, like, in theory, Goats is probably the best answer if you're not looking at the players' names. But because of the rosters you guys had, it made a lot more sense to go towards this alternate route. That's kind of where I was thinking about it, because when Element Mystic lost, like, a lot of people were like, well, maybe they should have just ran Goats. And I was just thinking in my head, like, that doesn't make sense though, right? Like, that's not
at all.
Right? Like,
yeah.
It's just like fitting like a square into like a triangle peg or something.
Yes.
Like, it's not going to work.
And that was so strange when they pulled up that graph on broadcast where it was just like everybody in the audience, all the pundits, all the analysts, Element Mystic 100%. And it was just like, did you guys see the meta?
I saw that. I was very confused. I was like, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I know a little bit about Overwatch. I was giving the other team like I was giving them like a 70% chance to win, basically.
Yeah, I've never seen a consensus like that in Korean esports history, where they just literally 100% of the Korean experts and panelists, casters, they just all picked Element Mystic to win. And I was in the same boat as the two of you. I expected them to not be able to run it into a team that is very, very comfortable and very prepared on Standard Goats and has made that their bread and butter, was the best Standard Goats team in Korea in Runaway. And yeah, I I commend them because I think there were a decent handful of other teams in Korea that were running goats and almost one-tricking goats and were playing it fairly poorly. And Element Mystic was having issues with that early in the season, and they found a way to change things up to fit their personnel, to fit their style, and to combat the goats meta. So I think they didn't really have another choice, another option of a composition to run. I think it was the right choice. It just did put them at a disadvantage because the one team that they're playing was the one team in Korea that I would expect to be able to handle their composition well. Like I did not expect Runaway to have a lot of problems. And a big part of that is the strength of QOQ on the Diva. I think that the one hero that has the best chance of punishing the Doomfist, tracking the Doomfist, not letting him get easy setups is the Diva. Diva can fly around and give the Doomfist trouble. As long as you don't get punched into a wall, you're not going to ever lose that duel as Diva. And if your Zen will throw a Discord onto the Doomfist, he can't win even if he lands the punch. But you saw QOQ taking a lot of cute spots where he would stand on like short high ground, standing on boxes and stuff when he went to go contest Sparkle. So Sparkle can't punch him. So there was no way for Sparkle to win the duel. He would have to give up his positioning, and then they have to fight on flat ground without that positional advantage. And unless they get really big ultimate value, they're just not really going to win that fight, right? The first fight on Control, or like the first fight on Hollywood, when there's no ults and the ground is even, the Doomfist comp should almost never win. They can overcome, kind of flat ground positioning with ultimates, but that's really their only chance, and you have to get big outplays. So I think QOQ deserves a lot of credit for his ability to track down Sparkle and take away a lot of those positions that he was trying to play from.
Yeah, that makes sense, because basically, as you said, so here's my question is, given the way the compositions works with goats and with the Doomfist, like, who do you think was the actual MVP of season 3 of Contenders for Korea? Because the one I picked was Sparkle, just because of the way that entire comp works, where like if he fucks up, basically the entire thing breaks down. Whereas like I can see like a lot of people were thinking more like along the lines of either the main tank of Runaway or QOQ, just because they're kind of like the defining factors of the way they play goats. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you kind of have to, in the same like logic, I think you have to give it to QOQ, because not only did he track the Doomfist very well and kind of shut that pick down for them, but he actually started to shift gears when they would rotate off the Doomfist and snipe the Diva and try to burst the enemy Diva before they could set up these Urshot or these bomb grav combos where you shoot out the graviton, you throw up the bomb, you charge or bash the Rhine, and you collect the payload inside, right? He would actually snipe the enemy Diva before they could set that up. So it was this weird, like, kind of a jarring head motion in boxing where you just throw your opponent off guard, where like they're trying to set up this combination and they haven't really kind of encountered that. So I really thought that he had a standout performance, but anybody on Runaway, honestly, there's very few people that I can look at that aren't at least like top tier. I don't know if MVP candidates, I think you could give it to Mag, but I would say QOQ for me is probably my MVP.
Yeah, I would say QOQ for the reasons we listed. He was really consistent all throughout the season, being very disruptive on Diva, being very creative. In my mind, in Goats v Goats, Diva is the hero that has the most flexibility, the most playmaking potential in every fight over and over, with just clever positioning, clever boop usage. I thought QOQ was a huge standout in that role. But I also think their Zenyatta player, Gangnam Jin, on Runaway deserves a lot of credit. He was fragging out. He was consistently using Transcendence at the right time, building them quickly, using them for counters, but not getting baited into using them too early to sustain people. Obviously, that relies on having good synergy, knowing your tanks aren't going to like overcommit and feed, right? So a lot of good communication internally that enabled that. But I think there were a lot of star potential players on Runaway, but the fact that these players that rely on knowing what their teammates are doing were the ones that were standing out, QOQ and Gangnam Jin. To me, that means that all of them were playing well and communicating well. Otherwise, there's not really room for the Diva and the Zen to shine to that level. So I think they all deserve a lot of credit, but those were the two standouts for me throughout the season. I was really impressed. If we're talking about players that made deep runs in the playoffs, those are my picks for sure.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about your team, because your team also lived or died off of the Doomfist.
Yes.
And I don't know what you guys thought, but I actually thought your team was probably the second best team in the playoffs. Just the way the playoffs worked out, I thought you guys put the best fight against Giganti, and I thought the way you guys strategized around like Giganti, I don't know if it was by coincidence or by purpose. But basically, I thought the way you guys approached the playoffs made the most sense of any team outside of Giganti, basically. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we were the second best team in Europe. I actually think we easily could have won that series and just had some misplays. It was unfortunate losing the very last submap on Control. Could have gone either way, and I'm confident we could have steamrolled any other team in playoffs. I mean, I know Scrimbucks is a meme, but if you ask any of the teams in EU, us and Giganti were having 90% Scrim win rates against every team in Europe. We were just clearly very ahead of all the other teams. And that was just because we were peaking at the right time, right? It's not that we were just better all season. We had struggles during the regular season. We just peaked in playoffs. It's unfortunate that because of the fact that we struggled in the regular season, we had a rough seeding and we had to play Giganti in the first round. And I, personally, I will push some of that onto the fact that we did have significant roster changes because of those signings. But I think that if you look at the first map that we played on Lijiang, they tried to play aggressively into the Doomfist comp. You cannot do that. That does not work. And they got punished very, very hard. Danid put on a show on Doomfist on that map. Then they, to their credit, they adapted very well and they started playing very defensively and playing the McCree comp. Well, our issue then was our response to that. Like I talked about before, there are kind of two modes, which is go on the back line, play really aggressive, or go on the front line and play more of a displacement role with the Doomfist. When they start playing McCree, that means they're opting out of Zarya. They don't have Zarya bubbles. They don't have Graviton for team wipe anymore. At that point, our job is to start playing the Doomfist like a disruptor, like a tank, like a frontline hero, no longer like an assassin. And we did not make those adaptations correctly, and we didn't make them quick enough. And that allowed them to get a ton of value out of the McCree that I don't think it actually works as a counter. We should have just been going on the Rhine consistently, and then the McCree is like very useless.
Yeah.
Especially because you can use your defense matrix before it got nerfed to cover your Doomfist while he's bubbled going in, and they have no way to pop the bubble, so he can use all of his cooldowns very aggressively on the tanks, and it's very effective. So I think that had we made those adaptations a little faster in the set, I would say that we would have been the repeat contenders, winners, not Giganti. But of course, I'm a little biased in that assessment. But yeah, I think just a ton of credit goes to them for their adaptation to the comp, because even if, I mean, I'm sure other teams were talking about, there were rumors about the fact that we were playing Doomfist Goats. I know Trid, one of the casters, reached out to me and asked if we were, not because he heard anything, but just because he knew we had such a good Doomfist and he thought like that we would want to play it. So I'm sure they had some expectation, but there's no one they could have practiced against that could play the comp even remotely at the level that we were. So this was not them being really prepped. This was them adapting on the fly, and that is very hard to do, and they deserve a lot of credit for that.
All right, well, Mo, what did you think of, did you watch that series? What did you think about it?
Yeah, no, I watched it live, gotta share on the friends. I'm friends with Dream and the manager Nuki. Was pulling for him, but I knew that Giganti, from hearing them talk, it was going to be a tough match, and I had heard to to the nth degree that the winner of this match was going to win the entire series. And lo and behold, Prophet Dream over here calling the damn show. It was a hell of a match. Li Zhang came out. He said they were going to be colorful. They came out with Hammond. I believe there was some Ash in there at some point from one of the teams.
Yeah,
it was crazy. I quite enjoyed it. If there was anybody to compete with British Hurricane, and again, I don't know scrims. I don't know anything behind the scenes. I guess it would probably either it would have to be Angry Titans or Samsung for me. I think Windstrike was a little bit too focused on the May, and I think everybody kind of started to figure it out after a while. Like, it was weird at first, but maybe Dream can dive a little bit more into that. But yeah, there wasn't. It did feel like it was the top of the class facing in the quarterfinals, and there wasn't a team that was going to consistently be able to put up a threat.
Yeah, I'd say Samsung and Windstrike were both teams that had interesting flavors on their tank comps. Samsung played a lot of Sombra, and Windstrike played a lot of Mei. But just like, in my opinion, the Doomfist doesn't actually win versus standard. I don't think those comps win versus standard goats. And if you're playing something that loses to standard goats, you're going to have a hard time winning Europe.
Especially. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's rough. Titans, I think, were interesting. Like, for part of the season, they tried to commit to be a dive team, and then swap back to tanks. So I think if they had spent the entire season refining their tank play, I think that they definitely could have made a run at the title there. But because they were also having this sort of like crisis of identity, they were not able to get to that level. Basically, the echoes of Eagle Gaming being just so unbelievably dominant on goats meant that a lot of teams in Europe were like, well, we don't think we can get to that peak. And everyone saw 1Point as the spiritual successor to Eagle, since they picked up the front line from Eagle. And everyone was like, well, we don't expect to be able to get as good as standard goats as we think 1Point will be. So we're going to try and have something different to throw at them. And it turns out that Giganti, the team that committed to actually playing standard goats the most, was able to prevail because 1Point self-destructed a little bit in the playoffs. And they had some issues leading into the playoffs. Maybe self-destructed strong, but I know they were having some internal issues. They were having some practice issues. And you saw Giganti be able to kind of handle things comfortably because of that.
Okay. So now I'm going to get into some hypothetical questions because of the way the Contenders currently works. None of you guys actually play any teams outside of your region. But I did think you and Giganti are kind of parallels to Element Mystic and Runaway in a sense. Both of you, you're the Element Mystic and they're like the British Hurricane of their region, whatever. So what would you think would happen if you guys played against Runaway for a start off? Like, do you think they could have adapted to what you guys were throwing out?
So I think that we had a game plan for both modes of play of the Doomfist, going on the front line and going on the back line. Element Mystic didn't. Element Mystic, the only time they would go on the back line at all was if Sparkle had a really good position and Trance was up and they were trying to force Trance. We would go on the Zen, even if they didn't have Trance, and just one-shot him, just kill him. Mm-hmm. And they didn't commit to that as much, and I think that's a mistake. I still think Standard Goats wins. I think that we would have a much better chance of competing with Runaway than Element Mystic did, just because we did have that game plan. We had practiced that a lot, and they didn't pull that out at any point during their run, really. But I think Giganti was the best Goats team in the world, and would be able to beat Runaway for sure. The question more comes down to whether we were the better Doomfist Goats team. And I think because of our extra game plan and the fact that we do not have to swap our Zarya player. So because our Zarya player stayed the same, and we actually had our off-tank player flex to Brig, and had our Brig player play the Doomfist, whereas they kept their Brig player the same. They have to rotate their Zarya if they want to change to standard Goats, right? And there are certain maps where you cannot play the Doomfist goats for the whole map. You have to swap back to standard. Numbani is a great example of that. You cannot play Doomfist goats at the end of Numbani. It will not work. So because of that, I think that we were the better Doomfist goats team, because when we have to transition off of Doomfist goats, we don't have to reset our ultimate economy with our graviton. We reset our rally, much less punishing. So I think because of the way our personnel lined up and how we emphasized playing the comp, I think that we would be the better Doomfist goats team. But I think if you put like all 4 of us in a bracket, I think Gigante probably comes up on top.
Yeah, I think Gigante probably comes out on top, and that's the weird thing about this meta, specifically kind of centered around that last season of Contenders. It wasn't Korean dominant. When you looked at the beginning of the season, they did not look good on goats at all. We've seen this in Europe for a good long while, so you kind of get acclimated to some of the general doings of goats and how it works. Like even just, watching it through osmosis and writing content about it, you start to learn just kind of the basics. Should you be charging halfway across the map? No, you shouldn't, Mag. But again, they learn very quickly. That's kind of Korean esports. They learn and adapt incredibly quickly, and we saw that progression specifically with Runaway from day one until the finals, and they looked like a brand new team. That said, when you put them against some other regions, I don't think that they were. I don't know. I generally don't know, but yeah, I would have to, I'd have to err on the side of caution and say that Gigante probably would beat them in a head-to-head. Now, when it comes to the British Hurricane versus Element Mystic, I do think that British Hurricane probably would have beat Element Mystic. I think positionally, EM had some very strange things going on with Sparkle's Zarya specifically. Kind of tended to feed sometimes. Did a lot of damage, don't get me wrong. He absolutely would lap people on Zarya charge, but would be punished. And again, when it comes to goats, Dream can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Zarya is a very, very large source of damage. When you have your specifically your damage charge, not your ult charge, constantly being reset, your damage overall is going to fall off. And I think that when it comes to the goats v goats matchup, British Hurricane's a little bit more consistent. When it comes to the flexibility matchup, pulling out those different colors, pulling out the Hammond, pulling out the Ash, whatever it may be, I have to give it to British Hurricane. So if you put them together in an international land, you let them acclimate, no asterisks there, I do think Hurricane probably takes it. Close, but probably take it.
Yeah, I think every other season of Contenders, Korea has been clearly the best region. Overall, right? I still think season 2 of Contenders, you make an international LAN, Eagle still beats everyone because no one was ready for that level of goats, and I don't think anyone has matched the level of goats that Eagle was playing at the time. But overall for the field, Korea was surely a stronger region in season 2. I think in season 3 of Contenders, it's very hard to argue that any region could stand up to Europe and the level of tank play that Europe was bringing, and then the level of counterplay to the tanks that we had, because our counterplay had to be so good to be able to beat some of these tank teams. We had to work so hard to get this to get any value at all. And then you look to Korea and you see, one pretty good tank team in Runaway. I mean, I don't want to take anything away from them. They are solid on tanks. I think that they definitely had some stuff, like you pointed out, the Reinhardt charges, that even though they got a little less frequent and maybe a little less far when they were used, they're still used way too often. You can't really get away with that in Europe at all. You will just feed. And using those support ultimates really aggressively, you can't do that. You lose, especially on payload maps where it's all about the long game and ult economy and drawing out time. You have to counter those tank ultimates with support ultimates, and Korea was not consistent at that at all. So I think that they picked up on tanks, but they didn't develop the nuances and the weird diva positionings. It got very, very nitty gritty in Europe in season 3. And I think that this was probably the first time since maybe Apex season 1, when Korea was first getting into Overwatch. There were foreigners really competing, obviously even winning. I think this is the first time since Apex Season 1 that you can reasonably make the argument, and I think the argument would be correct, that there was a region stronger than Korea.
And two things there. Chat, YouTube comments, don't even talk to me about NA. Fusion University had drop maps to Atlanta. And we, no offense to either of those teams, but again, you had difficulties versus Atlanta. I think you put them in Europe, and I think they probably make playoffs, but I don't think they touch semis, and I don't think they touch quarters. Maybe get a good bracket, who knows? But specifically talking about how Koreans use their support alts is something that I think I don't want to gloss over, because it is so different from the rest of the world. What I remember, Dream, you can correct me if I'm wrong. They would consistently use Transcendence to engage almost. They would like Earth Shatter and then trans on top of it, or they would trans into their own grav to kind of like protect against damage when they could better use Rally. Like, I've always kind of wanted to ask you, like, why do you think that is? Why do you think they're so different from a lot of other regions when we talk about specifically support alts?
So it's basically, this is something that people messed around with in Europe at first as well. And the idea is you want to use every tank ult to charge your other tank ult. So if I grav and they're going to live through the grav because they're using Beat or they're using Transcendence, I need to charge an Earth Shatter by swinging into that grav. And if I shatter and they counter the shatter with a defensive ult, I need to charge a grav by right-clicking the people on the ground, right? And hitting 2 or 3 people and getting that ult percentage. So to me, obviously, I mean, I'm not in a Korean team. I haven't spoken to Korean coaches about this. But that's something that we saw earlier in Europe that I think is what we see in Korea, and it's just an issue of time and development and playing with the meta, because as soon as a team decides to start holding those ultimates, and like you said, using Rally when it's available to punish, because that's enough healing and sustain for you to get in there and build up ults. But yeah, I think if we had seen that development in any team in Korea, I think they would have been able to beat Runaway, because I think Runaway was one of the teams notorious for being very aggressive with those ultimates. But I think it is about building one tank ultimate with the other. But the issue is the support ultimates are just as important as the tank ultimates. And that's what they underestimated, I think, particularly the Beat. Because if you're really confident in your Zen, you're like, yeah, we've got a fragging Zen. We play really aggressive. He's going to have a trance every fight and a half. Perfect. That's one thing. Your Lucio doesn't have a way to like greatly accelerate their ult charge in a GOATS composition. They don't have a way to just outplay the other team and get an ult every fight. You have to be very, very discerning with your Beat usage. So maybe, teams are like, yeah, we want to frag out with our Zen, get him to use trance so we can just farm another one. We're going to lap him. I very much disagree, but I can at least see stylistically trying to make it work. But the aggression with the Beat, I think there is no way that is the correct way to play the composition. And I think that, I think that it just shows the lack of development of that composition. But I think that it goes back to the fact that Europe has been playing tanks for a really long time. And Korea, outside of very, very early, has been a Winston Diva paradise. And we've not seen a lot of these tank-heavy compositions. So I think it was an issue of in Europe, teams were more willing to commit really hard to the tanks right away. And you also had a lot of coaches that were very experienced in tank metas, and shout outs go to Saida, who's the formerly of Giganti. He was with Giganti last season, now with Paris, has a long history of coaching tank teams to very high heights in Europe. And just people like that have a lot of experience in these tank comps and refining how to play tanks. I think that's kind of what gave Europe the edge in development there.
All right. So I'm going to side tangent a bit, but this is pretty interesting to me anyway. So basically back in StarCraft 2, there was a composition known as Broodlord Infestor, right? And basically it was one of the most imbalanced compositions, but it wasn't discovered right away. And the reason it wasn't discovered right away was because first somebody had to think about it, and secondly, the style of play is such that a Korean would never think about it. So, what I mean by that is like it's a very methodical, it's very methodical, it's very drawn out, and it basically goes against the basic fundamentals of of like a very high mechanical ceiling, because it's not emphasizing your mechanics so much as it's emphasizing your understanding of positioning, your patience, and the combination of like a spell ordering, I guess would be a good way to put it. And so nobody had come up with this until Stefano, and the reason Stefano comes up with this, and then he also comes up with like the basic build order that gets you the enough economy to get there, right? And when Stefano comes up with this style of play doesn't immediately is completely adopted by all of Europe, and all of Europe is playing it, but none of the Koreans are playing it, and none of the Koreans ever play it until like 4 or 5 months in. And what's interesting about that is like basically Korea and the West had a lot more cross-pollination compared to like the Overwatch scene. And so the reason I think the Koreans never did it is because they like to bash things. Like like they're very aggressive. They like to be very colorful.
Is it aggressive or is it stubborn? Like they take something.
It's
okay.
It's both. They basically, like, if it doesn't look cool in a sense, they're not as into it. And it's like kind of similar to China, except not as like they don't dive quite as deep, but they do dive pretty deep in that sense. And that's kind of that's kind of like a funny issue when I'm thinking about Overwatch, right? Because you're not even getting this cross pollination between the two regions. So when the Koreans went over and fought Stefano, they realized, oh god, this guy's really fucking good. But even then, the Korean Zergs didn't do it. They only did it when like the map literally forced them to do it. Because the way they thought about it is like, well, if I can get to 4 bases, I don't actually need to play that Stefano style, because I can just keep using my superior mechanics and then parlay that into a victory. But when there was like a map called Antigua Shipyard where you can only get three bases.
I hated that map. Good lord.
And basically they're like, oh, we literally have to play stalemate style, and the best stalemate style is Broodlord Infester.
Giving me PTSD, Stuchu. Oh.
Yeah, it's a terrible map, but
the third versus Protoss on ladder again. Like I was like high diamond, like low master. Like holy, that was a pain. And then you had like the gold in the middle that like Terrans would just expand to and put like a planetary. Like kill me.
Yeah,
anywho, sorry. Side tangent.
It was a fucking tough map. It was actually originally a 2v2 map too, so that's pretty funny. But basically, that's basically what I'm getting at is like I don't think Korea, like if I had to make a prediction, I don't think Korea is going to get much further down this goat's tree, as far down as Europe. I think so long as they keep fighting within each other, and I think that's going to continue to be the case. Like even with contenders like teams having that international tournament now, I don't think that's enough. I think they literally have to get bashed into the head like multiple times before they'll be willing to like go down that tree. And then in their minds they'll think, well, if I play mechanically a little bit better, maybe it'll work next time. So my guess is like they're not going to, like, I think from now until for like a few years, like Korea is never gonna supersede Europe in terms of this tank meta.
Really dumb question that neither of you might have the answer for. Isn't that kind of what's happening with like Korean League of Legends right now? Isn't that why like Griffin is like so highly touted, just because they're playing this like very aggressive, like high tempo style? Whereas like everybody's still kind of like, well, I don't know, guys, maybe we can scale. I don't know. Let's just keep picking Kaisa. I don't know. Like maybe we can just play slow. And Griffin's like, no, gank, high pressure, take the objectives. Like, is that kind of what you're describing?
Yeah, it's very similar, except like obviously like basically like Korean League of Legends evolved in a different manner because the existence of SKT.
Sure.
Because like, SKT play that late game scaling style, or they did.
Yes.
And so basically everybody thought, oh, that works.
That's the way, yeah, it wins you championships. So we're
Samsung
just gonna play
won
this.
And they're like, oh, surely that must work then. And then basically that's exactly what I think is happening. Like when they find a way to win, they stubbornly adhere to it in a sense.
Yeah.
So and Europe has generally been more pragmatic, and then NA has always been more wild. Like
Read bad.
Yeah. No, here's the thing. It's bad 99% of the time, but that 1% of the time you get like a true genius out of it.
Sure, yeah.
But like that 1% is really fucking hard to find. Fucking hard to find.
Well, you get the 1% and they become the 1% for like a split, and then they just go downhill from there.
Yeah.
Like they're wild and they figure something out that works, and then they just
but then other people just do it better than them.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Like the whole here's my prediction for NA esports as a whole. I don't think they'll ever have a truly great team sports. Actually, outside of CS:GO, I guess they will never have a truly great esports team, but they will have a few truly great individual players. Like I'm thinking, like because that one guy won't be burdened by the rest of his team. Basically, that's what I'm saying. But
yeah. It's God bless NA.
I think that as far as how Korea will continue to develop as we see GOATS continue into the future, I think GOATS is being weakened by the current patch. I think Blizzard doesn't really like GOATS, which I think is totally fair. As a coach and an analyst, I enjoy GOATS a lot.
Yeah.
I think there's an insane amount of strategic depth and optimization to be found in the comp, especially in the mirror. I think it's very, very interesting, but I understand why it's not super interesting for spectators, and it can be hard in the moment for observers and for casters to identify what micro plays are the difference makers, right? So I understand why they don't like it. I don't have a problem with that at all. But I think that means that they're going to try and make it continue to go away and at best be a very situational strategy. So I think that means that all other regions, I think Korea, China, and NA, as well as like the non-major regions like Pacific, Australia, South America, I think none of them are going to reach the developmental levels that Europe has in GOATS, because at this point, you're only running GOATS on maybe half the points, and a lot of those are modified versions of GOATS. People are swapping the diva out now that there's been a defense matrix nerf. People are putting Mei in her place more often than we saw previously. Right before, we would see it a little bit on like Nepal Village, for example, but we're seeing it on a lot more points now. It's not just Windstrike anymore. We're seeing people play Ash GOATS. We saw Kungdu Panthera in the past run basically an early version of like a Pharah GOATS comp with Ding. We're seeing people even run ball GOATS and use the ball in a similar way to that disruptive Doomfist style, where you can just constantly be pinballing the tanks everywhere. So I think we'll see more teams look for that style of GOATS instead of trying to really hone in and perfect the classic GOATS comp. And we can kind of see an example of that in Korea already with WGS. They deserve a little credit. They were the people that innovated and started running that GOATS comp with Monkey as the main tank back in Korean Trials at the beginning of Season 3. Did a lot of innovation there. Now they're not really running that comp anymore. They're running Sombra GOATS all the time. And they're not the first to run that, but they've committed more than any other team has, certainly. So I think we'll see more things like that, where there will be some teams that choose tanks as their style, but it won't be classic GOATS, and they won't be in GOATS mirrors all the time. And in my mind, GOATS versus a counter comp is a lot more linear, has a lot less depth, because it's just, can we survive long enough to get ultimates? And can we not die to like Barrage or EMP or something like that? It's much more simple, whereas in the mirror, there's a lot of very small things you have to do, a lot of those optimizations that exist. So I think because there's not going to be a lot of classic GOATS and there's not going to be a lot of GOATS mirrors, that means the necessity for getting that deep development isn't really there. And so I think that these other regions aren't necessarily going to be punished or be hurt that much by not having that level of innovation. The only issue is when they do get to an international competition, like the new Showdown and Gauntlet that's going to happen this year. Thank you, Blizzard. Thank you, Blizzard. I think if we do have a really good standard goats team from Europe make it, then maybe some of their counters that they're used to being able to run domestically won't work. And they'll have to get tighter with their comps or a little more creative. But other than that, I don't expect them to be punished super hard for their lack of investment into goats. I think EU went all in on tank comps. It's a part of their history. I think it paid off, but I think they're not going to be able to rely on that in the long term. We are going to move into a more diverse meta, both in Europe and just kind of internationally across the board.
The one thing I will say on goats, and I'll echo the sentiment that I heard from Sideshow, because I really thought this was well put. We've kind of had two eras. I don't like using the word modern because of reasons. But in the two last big kind of eras when it comes to Overwatch metagames, we had Dive and now we have goats, right? Dive kind of taught Overwatch how to play together, how to play coordinated, how to just, work as a team. Whereas I think goats actually really refined down the resource management and punishing, the lack of resources that the enemy has. So I really think that this next season of the Overwatch League, if, teams are really good at goats, which I don't know if you want to get into that, but I don't necessarily think is true for some teams.
Guganti would beat every single Overwatch League team in a goats mirror. Every single one. Okay.
Can't say he's wrong. But just by nature of how Contenders works, these are teams that have just been able to practice. When you look at the Overwatch League, they've been off. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like they've been off. Relaxing. That's again part of their stipulations there. The off season, you got to chill out. We don't want you to burn out. But when you look at Contenders, if goats is going to be what people are saying, 60-70% of the compositions. Yeah, I do think Contenders level teams probably would be able to take it to some OWL teams, at least early on. I can't speak, when we get to playoff stage 4. Maybe they'll learn by then. The meta could probably be completely different by that time, so it wouldn't even matter. But I really would like to see what this step looks like, because we have these. You can ask any Contenders coach for pages and pages of notes on how to play goats and what to look for. And you're seeing those coaches starting to draft into Overwatch League. So it is going to be a slow evolution, but you're going to start to see the best players in the world, or a majority, a very condensed population of the best players in Overwatch, start to really refine down their resource punishment. So this is going to be another big step in Overwatch kind of skill ceiling raising, where I'm excited to see at least what happens once we get very comfortable with goats and like what comes from that. And if we are going to see very colorful compositions, that it's not going to be just all goats. What are teams going to use to kind of deflate that bubble? I don't know, but at least I'm kind of excited.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think that it did put a lot of emphasis on resource management. It's still like positioning still matters in goats, right? Like you wanna have your Reinhardt have a corner to be able to duck behind. You want to play where they have to push around a corner into you. You want your Zen to have good sight lines, right? There are a lot of positioning things that matter, but nowhere near the level of positioning like micro that you have to keep in mind when you're playing things like Dive, when you're playing things like Snipers. Goats is very much about the resource management and who are you literally looking at, because you're limiting the information that you can get and you can communicate to your team literally just on what you are putting your eyeballs on. Mm-hmm. So I think those concepts are things that were not explored very deeply in previous metas in Overwatch. And I very much agree that that's a kind of a new school of thought about Overwatch fundamentals that will carry over into future metas. And we're already seeing it because of the nerfs and because of the different map pool for Contenders this season. There are a lot of maps where you just can't really get away with goats. Going back to some of the classic maps where we've seen a lot of Orisa defenses or a lot of snipers, like Junkertown. Come on, guys, it's snipers and pirate ship. It's not goats. But it does teach you a lot of those things, and it does have you keep a lot of those things in mind, and you can think of a lot of ways like, oh, they did this. This is actually punishable, where we didn't realize it was punishable before. So I think it will push the overall metagame and the quality of play and the amount of depth of general strategy does go up because of goats. But I think that even in regions where they didn't optimize goats, they still learned those lessons from goats. So I still think they get the benefits in the future despite not hitting the peaks in the short term.
Okay, that was a lot to digest. Let me think about this for a second. Because, all right, because I've been following Blizzard games for a long time. So generally, have you ever seen that comic where like they kind of, or I forget who did it, but they basically explain how each developer sort of does their balance changes? Where like League of Legends, like they take away the 2 giant swords and they just give them sticks.
Yeah.
In Blizzard, they pass around the gigantic ass sword between each player, and then Dota 2, they all have gigantic ass swords.
Everybody's got big swords.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's kind of how Blizzard has continued to evolve from StarCraft 2 to like Overwatch to like any other games at this point. Yep. So it's interesting in the sense like I don't actually agree with it just because it feels like they're forcing. How do I say this? They're forcing a specific type of skill set to be emphasized in the meta, right?
And it feels almost arbitrary sometimes.
Yeah,
it is.
Just like we're tired of seeing this. Let's move it this way.
Like it is arbitrary. Like that's kind of like the problem. Like if you look like in StarCraft 2, I think the best positional and mechanical meta was probably Muta, Ling, Baneling versus Terran Bio, right? Because there's a lot of mechanics in it. There's a lot of positioning. There's a lot of economics and a lot of min-max stuff, right? But like they changed it because they got bored of it, and that's kind of what's happening here. So I'll bring up the disadvantages. Basically, like you're basically focusing on a different skill set each time, and so you'll never have a good linear way of measuring players across time, essentially. Yep.
Like, and I don't know how tangentially you want to go from that, but I think that comes from specifically how some games are developed without much else to change or add. Whereas you look at StarCraft, it's like, okay, well, what can we really change to like keep the game fresh and neat and cool for people? Same thing with like League. There's really no way to change the game to keep people involved, so they have to constantly either add items, which kind of changes the balance of the game, or they have to change heroes or add heroes.
Or rework the jungle every year.
Yeah, or that, right? Or rework how Dragon works, or how, we're going to give you a mini Baron before 20 minutes. It's just like, if there was another mode to the game that people were really interested in, and it's, we're starting to see that with other games, looking at StarCraft 2, they added co-op. Finally, we can stop balance changing as content and adding novelty. We can actually just go and add cool stuff that people are going to be really interested in. And I think you're starting to see that with developers. But again, side tangent, back to esports, boys.
Oh yeah, I actually think Blizzard's done it wrong. Like
okay,
for the casual thing, like I think I told them to their face a few times because I was like at one of their summits, like basically I said like it doesn't make sense to patch the game for casuals. It makes more sense to because like when you just look at the figures, right? Like the single player game sells like 10x, 20x more than the multiplayer game does. So it makes a lot more sense just to create a bunch of single player or special events for the casuals, and then just leave multiplayer for the hardcore people.
Thank you, Stuchu. Give Overwatch PvE. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, like I think that's easy, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't know how easy. I'm not a developer, but that would be the thought process on being able to slow down the changes to the ladder and reworking that. So the people who do feel like, well, I log in Overwatch, what can I really do? I don't want to play quick play because it's really not Overwatch. It's just 6 people playing DPS and it's kind of fun, I guess. But if I don't have any friends on, what's the best way to play Overwatch? Well, it's probably to play ranked. And I'm kind of a Zenyatta one trick and I really don't like playing anything else. So I'm going to play Zenyatta and have fun my way. That's not really conducive to having a great, ladder experience. Give those people something else to do.
Yeah, exactly. And there's been a lot of speculation around that in that they've slowed down how much content is in their seasonal events and some of the development cycle stuff around Overwatch. There's been some speculation that maybe they're moving to more of a single player or a PvE focus for the content where they gear the multiplayer more towards Overwatch League. There are some unannounced changes that I don't want to get in trouble for leaking around contenders that are additionally very positive past the lands that have already been announced. So I think Blizzard is starting to realize that this is a situation where you can have your cake and eat it too.
Exactly.
You can actually please both crowds, because it doesn't take nearly as many resources to please the multiplayer crowd as it does for the single player. So if you put that effort into the single player, it keeps them happy. And if you keep the multiplayer, just keep the wheels on. And that's about good enough. So it seems, at least from what I've seen so far this year, that that's starting to come across to them. And again, I don't want to like leak too much, but there's more good news coming. So fans of Overwatch esports, be happy and wait for some more announcements you'll be glad about.
Yeah, classic Blizzard. Too late, overcompensated later.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey.
Well,
who knows? Maybe they'll get it right for Overwatch 2. Yeah.
We will see. But yeah, I was talking about like those are obviously the disadvantages. Like you're shifting it from place to place to place. But here are the advantages, basically. Like if you do that, if you shift the meta like to directly impact a specific trait or skill, that trait or skill is going to be studied to its optimal, to its like highest nth degree. That's why when you think about like you guys already brought up dive, and then you brought up goats, but in like StarCraft, like what would happen would be like, okay, so now everybody's playing this high tempo mutilating baneling style, right? And then next it became like very very high control like deathball style, and then after that it became more about, well, actually one player changed it, but it became more about like ratting or like split pushing, like stuff like that. Basically, if you change it like that, everybody just focuses their one thing on that one thing, or I mean focuses all the resources on that one thing, and then that forces like, basically that's the fastest way to learn, is just instead of spreading it all across, you're just focusing on one specific area. Like that's an advantage, but like I'll go ahead and say it. I think it's better in general to have a game that allows for all or a majority of these skill sets to have advantages and disadvantages, to be rewarded or punished asymmetrically, like kind of like how Brood War does it, kind of how like
Dota does it
basically.
Yeah. And I think those are the two big examples that you hear echoed a lot, or kind of used as talking points when you talk about how games, ideally could be balanced. And I'm not well versed in either of those enough to kind of speak on them, but I wonder if could you do it with Overwatch? I don't know how you'd be able to. But again, that's the ideal, is if everything is really good and it's just down to the player style, down to the team style. And some teams just are stylistically different and they have bad matchups. Some are the same and they have mirror matchups. And that's really cool. And that's really fun for the audience. It's really fun for the analysts. It's fun for everybody. But it feels like it just doesn't work for some games. What do you guys think that is?
Well, I think in the case of Overwatch specifically, I think that they, at least from my perspective, with like the heroes they've released since the game came out and the balance changes they've made that have like enforced these big meta shifts, I think that they don't see Overwatch as like developed enough or finished enough that parity will exist naturally, because the heroes that they've been releasing, in my mind, they've been attempting to release like there's jokes that like Riot would release the new hero and make them super OP, so everyone will get them and buy a bunch of RP to get the skins for them and stuff like. Well, for me, I mean, in Overwatch, the hero doesn't cost anything when they come out. You just get them day one. For me, it seems like they're releasing these heroes not because they want them to be really overpowered, but because they want them to be paradigm shifting, because they want them to change the game, because they don't want Overwatch to be this static thing. They want it to develop to the point where there are a ton of different viable strategies, and it can be just based on your style. You look at Anna coming out, the first hero radically different than anything that was in the game, a healing sniper, right? Not something you're used to seeing. You have Sombra, AoE silence in this like FPS MOBA hybrid. It's and with invisibility. It's very paradigm breaking. Doomfist feels like a fighting game character, or like Riven, where it's these animation cancels and these weird combos. Now we have Wrecking Ball, who is completely feels out of place in what you would call an FPS game, in label. So I think
Erasa's weird kind of place where you're like, is she a tank? I don't know. She's got a cool ability, and her alt's cool but boring. So it's like a wall. Everybody just is like super, just like this ragtag misfits group of like heroes where it's just like, yeah, I guess they kind of fit. Maybe, I don't know. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. So it feels like they're wanting to hit this critical mass before they get to this like equilibrium where all skill sets are created equal. I think they haven't gotten there yet. Maybe it's misguided to have that be the goal, or to have it take so long into a game's lifespan for that to be your approach. I'm not really going to comment on that part, but that's just how it comes across to me as their philosophy, is that they are still looking to add things that will completely shake up how the game works, and they want to get all of these interesting paradigm shifting mechanics out there before that equilibrium point is reached. That's at least what it comes across to me for Overwatch specifically.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a few thoughts about this. First, I don't think any developer can actually know when they reach that point.
Yeah.
Like, I'll give you an example. Like, when Brood War came out, it got to the point where, like, people thought the Reaver was completely overpowered. And basically Terran couldn't win anything. Right? And then, so the developer at the time was Rob Pardo. And he thought to himself, maybe I should change it so that Terrans have a better chance. And he was really thinking about it. He was drawing up plans. He was thinking about the numbers. He was thinking if maybe I should change the mechanic. And then Boxer won, right? And then basically he came to the conclusion, well, wait, Boxer basically did something I could never think about. And then he also came to the conclusion that, like, I can never really know what my changes are doing. And the only people that will figure it out are, like, the highest competitive players. So that's why I decided I'm not touching Brood War ever again. Like, at least for changing the exact balance of that particular game.
Right.
And now that particular game was like getting lightning in a bottle. Like, it hasn't been really replicated in a sense. Like, even if you talk about like Dota 2, like Dota 2 changes all the time, and that's because of the patching. Whereas like Brood War is like one of those games where it's never been changed, right?
I think the only other game, like esport, I would say compares in that same way is probably Super Smash Bros. Melee. In that same way, where it's just like, it's a complete mistake. We almost hate it. Like, it's not what we intended, but it's kind of beautiful, right?
Well, Sakurai kind of intended it, but then he realized he made a mistake. He thinks it's a mistake. Like, basically, as far as like I've read into that, basically, his thinking was like originally like this Smash Brothers is gonna be my masterpiece of fighting games. That's literally what he thought. And then when he finished, he's like, wait, I completely forgot about the casual side. I fucked up.
Yeah,
that's kind of what he thought about it. That actually gets to my second point is like, I don't like, I'm fine with all skills being equal in a sense. Like, but here's my problem is like, I want them equal in terms of difficulty put in. And what I mean by that is like, the stronger the strategy, the higher the skill floor has to be in order to execute that strategy. And that's kind of like what Melee is basically is. Like, if you think about that entire game, that entire game's lifespan, I think it's pretty easy to say like Fox is probably the best character, right? I think it's pretty easy to say that. But like, the reason nobody gives a fuck about that is because it's also like the hardest character to play.
Yes. Super glass cannon-y, like you just get chain grabbed and you get puffed and you get wobbled. Like, there's so many other just super big sticks like you're talking about. Like, it's very difficult to be good. It just happens that, everybody, like you mentioned, spends the time, works on it, refines it down. That's why you see, a lot of top 8s consisting of, at least in the past. I can't speak on that too much anymore because we're seeing Pikachu and Puff in the top 2. But it's, at least in the past, it was very much Fox centric.
Yeah, and I will say that Melee is a good example of a game because obviously it's existed for a long time. There haven't been balance changes, and we've seen a defined meta that shifts over time. A great example is the complete reinvention of how Captain Falcon works as a character in like 2015 by the 20XX crew in Central Florida, right around where I'm at actually. But if you look at like placings, you do see Fox like really high up there, and he rewards tech skill to like a very high level, right? Like that's so like more than any other character in the game. Fox needs insane levels of tech skill. But you look at the other characters that do really well. We look at the in my mind, the two greatest Smash players are Armada and HBox, and they play characters that are not tech skill intensive. I mean, they have their own tech skill stuff, but Peach and Jigglypuff are much more about stage control and spacing than they are about tech skill. And it's very arguable to me which one of those is harder, and also which one of those is more effective, because for all like they're also like the only people to achieve even relatively that much success using their characters. So it's really hard to gauge in my mind in most games which one does have the best, which strategy or style or skill set has the best like input to output kind of reward. Which one is the most efficient? Like if I can get really good at this, will I just be absolutely unbeatable? I think it's really hard to tell. So I think it is unknowable, but I think that's not necessarily an argument against the style of like waiting for this equilibrium point, because an equilibrium point will like roughly exist, but like Fox is considered nowhere near as dominant as he was like 3 or 4 years ago. There are plenty of people that think he has a even matchup with Marth, for example. So yeah, I think it's up in the air a little bit.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the point. Like if you think about the way Melee works, like you have to put like you're not putting in a lot of like tech skill for Jigglypuff or Peach, but you're putting in a lot of different types of skill that nobody else can really replicate, and that's why that's why only those two people exist, basically. Like, and the same thing could be said about like Yoshi, arms of Yoshi to a certain extent, but like basically that's kind of the problem with Blizzard games, I guess, or not Overwatch yet, but certainly with StarCraft 2, whereas like my biggest hang up with Brutal Infestor wasn't that it was that overpowered, it was that easy to execute.
Yes.
Like,
and it was super safe. Like what do you do? Like what do you do as Terran to punish it? Well, it's like maybe we get some vultures and we go back to like playing bio and we drop everywhere and we kind of become the Zerg and they become like this weird mech kind of variant. It's very slow. And then like Protoss, like I don't know what you do. I can't even remember that far back.
Basically, Protoss came to the conclusion you kill them before they get there.
Yeah, sure. We just two base all in every game. Okay.
But like the timing was extremely like thin. It was like a 30. It was like a 30-second to a minute timing. And then that's also the same conclusion MVP came to. Is like, okay, I have to literally kill them in the time it takes to morph the Corruptors into Broodlords. Like that's literally his timing. That's like a 30-second in-game timing. So it's like an actual like 20-second game timing. Like that's so stupid, but that was kind of how it worked.
Yeah, I think that the biggest issue is if something isn't punishable. If it's quote easy to execute or whatever. People were saying that about GOATs early on, but we can see that the teams that were good at GOATs were consistently smashing the other teams. So there is a gap in execution and in skill from team to team, right? So there is this difference. It's just the fact that they can commit so hard to this style and play nothing else and not get punished for it. That's where I see it as being problematic from a balance perspective. If it can't be punished, I think that if it's quote easy, I think that's usually a little overblown how easy something is to execute because we're watching the best people in the world execute it. I think they help make it like look a little easy, right? But it's if there's no counterplay, that's when there's a problem for me. If there's counterplay that just emphasizes another skill set and whoever pops off using their relative skill set better wins, great. But if it's just not really punishable, if it's just super safe all the time, that's when it gets really stale and boring and problematic in my mind.
And that's where I think people were talking about with like, oh, it's so easy. It's like, well, you probably realize it's not easy to be the best player in the world. So like, I don't think they meant easy in that sense. I think what they meant was like very simple, very linear. Like the best way to beat something is just to run it yourself, because that's kind of just how Overwatch has been for a long time. Like if you don't know how to beat it, you can mirror it, and you'll probably do okay. If you haven't practiced it, you mirror it, whatever. And it kind of is echoed in a lot of games, but Overwatch has a weird, it's designed in a way that mirroring is always going to be a thing. And it just so happens that GOATS was that dominant. So like, yes, like I get what people were saying with like, oh, it's so easy, because I think they meant that it was just so linear with like, well, better go GOATS, and that's all you see forever. And there's no deviation away from it. So like in that way, I guess they consider it easy. But I mean, I don't know, if you ask them a series of questions, I don't think they would say like it's easy to be like this good at something. But
yeah, and early on, for GOATS, obviously it was mostly playing GOATS versus counter. It was before a lot of people committed to the mirror.
yes.
And the mirror is where I think the depth exists.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you are playing against a spam comp as a counter, it is very linear and it does feel very boring. But once the mirror exists, and of course that's a big thing in Overwatch, because A, control is a thing, and B, there's no draft, so you can just have a literal mirror composition, whereas opposed to like in MOBAs, you can have a strategic mirror where both teams are playing team fight comps, or both teams are playing split push, but they don't have literally the same characters. So that's what pushes Overwatch that way in my mind. But yeah, I think there was a lot of bias against it early, because early people were still trying to counter it instead of going for the mirror. And I will agree, it's not a lot of fun, or very engaging, even as a coach, to be involved in GOATS versus a counter comp. There's not a lot to be had there.
We run at you. We build Earth Shatter in 12 seconds. We Earth Shatter you, you die. Congratulations. Next match.
Exactly.
I will point out there is difference between Brulor Infestor and GOATS, in that Brulor Infestor, you had a bunch of upsets that never existed afterwards. Like a bunch of Zerg players got ridiculously high placings, and then did literally jack all for the rest of their careers. And I'm talking about like 8 years in. Like they literally did nothing. So like you're not gonna see that with GOATS, basically.
Who was was it MVP Sniper who like won a GSL and then nobody remembers they actually won a GSL?
Yeah, but like he wasn't the worst one, but yeah,
he's a pretty big one though, right?
He's most well known because he did it in such a way that it ruined like everybody's like fan favorite.
He just had like a bunch. He had like 3 Zergs leading up to the final, right?
Yeah,
if I remember,
he had a Terran and like somebody else, but basically that was his problem, was like he killed like the Terran Hope, like all of them. So it was like that's kind of why he's like the most remembered, but there were quite a few of those types. So like that's kind of like the difference between them, is like I actually do think Brulor Infestor was relatively easy for a pro game, whereas like I don't actually think that's the case for GOATS, especially in a GOATS v GOATS like meta. Like you were, I don't know if you were joking or serious about it, but I'll go ahead and say I think like Giganti probably would destroy like almost every like Overwatch.
No, that was not a joke.
That was not a joke at all.
So here's something I'll add to that. Obviously, Paris right now versus Paris 2 months ago is not the same team. Saida, Demon, great coaches. Fefe, who was the coach of Eagle Gaming, all on staff for Paris, all very good coaches, very good tank coaches. I'm sure Paris has progressed a lot since they were scrimming in EU before they went to LA to prep for Overwatch League. They were losing to the good contenders teams in scrims in Europe. They were not winning the tank matchup. It's not very arguable. It wasn't particularly close, but they're being touted as like insanely good at GOATS, scrimming these Overwatch League teams. So to me, I expect Saida to be a coach that helps develop people over time. He's consistently gotten Giganti players signed to Overwatch League, completely new roster after another, like insane at developing talent and developing teams. I'm not sure that he can work his magic that quickly. I think there is a gap between the European contenders teams that have been grinding GOATS for 6 months versus some of these Overwatch League teams that were on break during the majority of the GOATS meta. So I don't think it's a skill thing. It's just an amount of hours put into the composition thing. But yeah, I think Gigante would run the table if there was a tournament right now with like all the Overwatch League teams and Gigante, Gigante would win. Yeah.
Even like a team like Runaway, I think would probably still do considerably well. I just
middle of the pack at worst.
Yeah.
I don't think Runaway would be that bad against the Overwatch League teams.
Yeah.
A good majority, yeah. If you just took that Runaway roster, put him. I mean, this happened last season with season 1 of Overwatch League. You could probably take, like, there's always going to be those exceptions that you could just take, slot into the Overwatch League, and they're just going to be better by virtue of just having more time on the meta.
Sure.
Just fact.
Yeah. So that's why I kind of like prefer an open system. Give them a chance to smash.
Yeah.
Them, but, it's not not
Can't have that
here.
with the big bucks, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about it covers it. Right, went over everything. Went over goats and Doomfist and all that. So, you guys have any last words you want to say?
I'll say that Europe is going to continue to be criminally undervalued, despite being the best team, or the best region rather, for the last season. And I think that more teams need to be recruiting from European talent. I think that just like we talked about, a lot of lessons were learned from the GOATS meta. I think that picking up some of the players that were in the middle of that, experiencing that, brings a lot of knowledge and understanding to your team that's being undervalued. So I think we hopefully will see some scouts pick up on the European region a little bit. And once again, thank you, Blizzard, for these international contenders events. I think that'll be a great way for Europeans and South Americans. There's that new South American super team that is looking to go to the showdown. So I'm hoping that these international events are going to help people in non-NA and Korea get more scouting, because there's a lot of global Overwatch talent.
I can't disagree with anything Dream said. I like it a lot. The international lanes are going to be really fun to watch. It really kind of stacks the end of the season. When it comes to just Overwatch, it feels like a build up. We have the finals, we have playoffs for the main stage, and then we have the gauntlet to kind of look forward to as well. So I think this is a start of a great little year, and I think we're only going to be seeing things go up from here. At least fingers crossed. Hopefully that's the case.
All right, and I think there are too many NA players in Overwatch League and not enough European players. Like, I think a number should probably be flipped. Just throwing that out there for you scouts. All right, see you guys later.